Thank you all so much for being here on the second day, the second week of our seminar on Black Reconstruction in America. We appreciate everyone in the room and also everyone on the Zoom or on the YouTube stream for their patience as we smooth out our technical difficulties. Last week, for those who were on the YouTube, we had a significant delay, some sound issues. The goal is that, that these have been smoothed out, but regardless, this is a work in progress. Regardless, we're getting through it. And again, we appreciate you all hanging in there and having some patience as we do this. It's an experiment for us. And we're always really grateful when when comrades hang out for the experiment and grant us that patience and let us hold this space and trust us with the space as we have these conversations. As just a reminder for folks, we have people in the room. This is a hybrid seminar. We have an amazing crew of people in front of us. And we also have, a crew on YouTube. Both of those groups will be able to contribute questions, to this conversation. And we hope to have as much of a discussion as we can have, given the format. Last week, we'll begin obviously with just a bit of a recap of some things that came up last week. I know some folks maybe couldn't make it last week. And we talked a little bit about framing out Black Reconstruction. Who is W.E.B. Du Bois? When did he write the sort of background for it and what he was trying to do, right? This is really a set of the book and what we find, left to themselves were saying about it, their experiences of it, what they were themselves were saying about it, their experiences of it, what they were trying to accomplish and what they did accomplish. And his goal in kind of re-centering formerly enslaved people in this narrative, in this story, wasn't, if we remember in the To the Reader section, it wasn't to, as he puts it, prove, in his words, to prove that Negroes were black angels, right? It wasn't to say anything exceptional or special, but it was to say very specifically, as he puts it, that they were just average, ordinary human beings. In other words, the mistakes, the missteps, the limitations of Reconstruction are the limitations of any human project. And yet on top of that, it was an unprecedented attempt to build something truly radical. And we remember that the title that we received, Black Reconstruction in America, was not the original title that Du Bois had sought, to give the book. He had titled it Black Reconstruction of Democracy in America, right? A far more ambitious title, right? A title that shows the way, and this is part of the argument that he's going to make, shows the way that formerly enslaved people in the United States rebuilt a different kind of democracy, a better democracy, what he'll call, in a phrase that's very often used today, abolition democracy. Something different from just the kind of liberal representative democracy that we generally have access to. And we concluded a bit last week talking about Du Bois, the questions raised by Du Bois' analysis of propaganda. We began with the last chapter of the book called The Propaganda of History, because we wanted to understand what it was that Du Bois was up against, the kind of historical accounts, textbooks, prevailing academic arguments that he was trying to dismantle. And so he's confronting propaganda as we ourselves confront propaganda all the time. But we also wanted to raise questions because he was trying to distinguish, if people remember, propaganda from, what are the four categories? History as a science, from philosophy, and from what he calls prophecy. And at least on my end, I'm always sort of feeling very strongly that Du Bois is doing all of these things, right? That, he himself is a propagandist. He does a great deal of propaganda work. And at the same time, he does historical science, he does philosophy, and he certainly does prophecy. And we see the prophetic turns in his writing as he sort of, puts them forward. And we talked just briefly, this is the last bit of the recap, about how to read Du Bois a little bit, how best to focus in on the moments where he turns prophetic, right? To focus in on the summaries and to focus in, this is something we'll again practice today, beginning. These very condensed, sets of maybe 50 to 100 words in which he says a great deal in a very sort of intentional way. Now we begin the book in earnest, and we begin it with, with a pair of chapters that are meant to be understood as a pair of chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, which, as you can see, and this is something just to look at and reflect upon, even in the table of contents, are written in parallel, right? the black worker and the white worker. And the first question, although it's not one we're going to answer now, that we want sort of in the back of our heads, is this question of why he wrote these together, why he uses the phrases the black worker and the white worker, and why he divided them into two chapters, right? He doesn't write one chapter called The Workers, right? The working class. And yet he specifically calls them, chapters about workers. So what is it that he's doing by grouping them together as workers, and what is he doing by keeping them apart as black workers and white workers? And this is a question that really raises more questions, right? There's no easy answer to it, and it's something that's going to provoke us in terms of the way we're thinking about the content of the text and what it's trying to accomplish. First and foremost, he's saying that these are both groups of workers, right? And it's important to reflect on why this would be even controversial, right? If we think of workers in the broadest sense, it shouldn't be controversial. There are people working in factories in the US North at the time. There are people working on plantations in the US South. Why would we not understand these both to be workers? As we mentioned last time, this is a book that's written by Du Bois, the Marxist, right? Someone who's developing a Marxist analysis, who's using and deploying Marxist categories, and yet at that time, but also honestly today, from a very traditional Marxist standpoint, it's unclear whether or not enslaved people are understood as workers, right? And it's unclear because the traditional Marxist framework is one that understands workers as fundamentally wage workers under capitalism. In other words, people who work for a wage, who are exploited, whose labor is then extracted as what's called surplus value and turned into profit and reinvested as capital, right? That is a traditional Marxist understanding of how within capitalism properly understood, workers means wage workers, fundamentally and centrally. And there's also a historical vision built into traditional Marxism in which slavery is a prior form of production, right? One of the earlier modes of production that then gives way to feudalism, which then gives way to capitalism. And in both of these, you have a lot kind of built in and a lot to unpack in terms of the ways that certain Marxist and Marxist parties and organizations uphold these sort of frames. And again, these are very strategic, very political questions, right? Is a communist party, is a Marxist organization centering and emphasizing only wage labor? How does it understand the importance of that wage labor, and how does that relate to people who do unwaged labor, right? Or who work, on plantations, or who work in the countryside, or if we're talking about on the global level, who are campesinos, who are rural workers. How do these fit into an understanding of the working class? These are very, very big questions. But what's important in terms of just what Du Bois is already doing by calling these chapters the white worker and the black worker, is that he's first and foremost, and we foregrounded this a bit last time, he's, sort of suggesting and insisting to us that capitalism is always racial in a certain kind of way. Again, when we talk about racial capitalism, part of what we mean is the ways in which capitalism has always been and will always be a system that takes advantage of and builds up and builds upon sort of racial framings and racial categories. So that slavery isn't just another form of wage labor, of course, but it's something that's integrated into that broader capitalist system. And the second piece is that integration is central. So a big part of what Du Bois is going to show us in these first two chapters is the way that slavery was, at the moment that he's talking about, so the middle of the 19th century, central to capitalism in the US and central to global capitalism, right? Absolutely central, right? And again, this is kind of explosive if we think about a traditional Marxist understanding in which the most highly developed capitalist societies are centered on wage labor, on factories. That's not what Du Bois is saying, right? In the middle of the 19th century, which is the height of US capitalism in a lot of senses, specifically even at the time that Marx is speaking. These are some of the sort of contributions that Du Bois is already making. And I always want to emphasize, pause? Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then, how do you put the chat up? How do you put the chat up?
All right, everyone. Apologies to everyone here. Apologies to the folks on the stream. Hoping some of this is fixed. Again, we appreciate it. It's fine. We could stress about it, or we could just understand that it's part of the process. I hope that wasn't too disruptive for anyone. But, you know, we were talking a little bit about the ways that even the architecture of what Du Bois is putting together in this book, right? Even the table of contents is super revealing in terms of thinking about the contribution that he's making and that he's trying to make, right? So if you look at the layout of the chapters and you see the black worker and you see the white worker, and he's writing this in 1935, you know that he's doing something fundamental when it comes to an intervention into Marxism, right? And we'll talk about this a lot, right? We'll talk about it later on in this session, but it's worth foregrounding that what he's doing is that he's transforming Marxism by using it. He's transforming Marxism in the process of deploying the categories, by deploying them in a certain kind of way, right? In a way that's attentive to white supremacy, to slavery, to the legacies of chattel slavery in his moment, but also to the practice of chattel slavery in the past, right? So he's already doing that. And you know, what I was just going to emphasize is the ways in which I'm constantly, and this is also a warning to you all because I will 100% do this, I will refer to a very important parallel text to this, which is The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. If people haven't read it, absolutely essential account of the Haitian Revolution in conjunction with the French Revolution. It's talking about an earlier period, about an incredibly important and forgotten and erased moment in history, which is the Haitian Revolution. But what C.L.R. James is doing, and he's writing at the exact same time as Du Bois, is to show many of the same dynamics playing out, right? And specifically, he does the same thing with these categories, right? He disrupts the understanding of the proletariat and the working class in the process of deploying it to describe enslaved people in Haiti. So that's just to foreground this piece. In these two chapters, right, these parallel chapters, the black worker on the one hand and the white worker, he's really going to show both of these pieces. In other words, the question of racial capitalism, the role and the mobility of race as a category within capitalist history, and the centrality of enslaved people to the capitalist economy, and the centrality of the revolt and the rebellion that they're going to engage in, that he describes as, and again, very important to understand the controversial way that Du Bois describes black resistance in the context of the Civil War as a general strike, right? By calling it a general strike, he's doing something incredibly important, right? And that's crucial. So as we dig into these, again, just look at the chapter summary. So open up to page 3, right, if you've got it in front of you. This is the black worker, right, chapter. And the summary that you read at the top of page 3 says how black men coming to America in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries became a central thread in the history of the United States, at once a challenge to its democracy, and always an important part of its economic history and social development. Every word of this is intentional, right? He's already pointing toward the centrality of the role of slavery within the capitalist economy, and the political importance that will bring us, right? And he describes very quickly the way in which slavery in the U.S. is understood as an anomaly. Right? It's an anomaly, it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction in a country specifically where, the so-called, rights are held to be equal, right? A so-called democracy. And yet you have, this category of, at the time, 4 million people who are held, of course, in subjugation. He describes, and he goes through, if people read this, the interesting sort of impurities of that category, right? He says, this is a very interesting way to read this. He says, these workers, again, the chapter is called The Black Worker. These workers were not all black and not all Africans and not all slaves, right? He talks about people being mixed with white and indigenous people. He talks about the fact that, and this is a very important piece, that in the 16 and 1700s, there were a large number of free and even property holding, black people in the United States. And he talks about the fact this is a kind of prehistory to the sort of story and the moment of contradiction that he's going to describe. Now he says that, and this is over on the next page, he talks about the ways in which the way of managing this contradiction initially was to ban the slave trade. The international slave trade is banned in 1808, I believe. And that this was assumed to be the resolution of the contradiction, right? We no longer will be importing enslaved people. There will no longer be an international slave trade, and therefore the problem will go away. Du Bois says, interestingly enough, it didn't go away, right? And the contradiction, or this unthinkable contradiction, continued. And it's, as he puts it in very interesting terms on page 4, again, the nation waited and its conscience sank to sleep, right? So there's a forgetting, there's an ignoring of this contradiction and of this problem. And this all points to a really interesting and crucial anomaly as well, which is the fact that in US history, the importance of slavery comes very late, comparatively speaking. We're talking about this sort of crisis that emerges in the mid 19th century, right? The middle of the 1800s. That's incredibly late, right? That's after the banning of the international slave trade. That's after abolition in other places, well after abolition, right? And yet it's not until the late 1700s that slavery really begins to pick up steam in the US context, right? So just important to foreground that, right? Slavery had been this sort of prior phase of the early development of capitalism for other European colonial forces, and then becomes incredibly important in the US very, very late, right? This has huge implications, right? And the question is why? I'm sure people know what the answer to that question is, but the answer is cotton, right? The answer is the cotton boom, King Cotton. And it's, again, you have this interesting contradiction that it's around the time that slavery, the international slave trade is banned, that cotton begins to boom in the US, right? That may seem like a very basic and obvious material piece of the analysis, but it has such major implications that is important to foreground. Because what happens when cotton expands is that the profits associated with the slave economy expand dramatically, exponentially, by an incredibly huge amount. And the biggest and most important implication of this is that suddenly the contradiction that Du Bois had identified, right, between a system that professes democracy and a system that relies on chattel slavery, is that it needs to be managed, right? How do you resolve that contradiction? How do you explain it away? And so again, what's very interesting is that you don't have a uniformity of the way that white supremacy operates throughout US history. It doesn't always operate in the same way. It's not an eternal force that is always taken exactly the same forms. It gains new importance for economic reasons, for the profit that slavery offers in the context of cotton production. And that requires new justifications and new explanations, right? So the narratives around slavery are, I want to say, almost new, not totally new, but they're reinforced, they're reinvigorated. There are new arguments that come forth about how slavery is justified, right? There are new biological arguments that are developed about biological inequalities that make certain people subject to enslavement. But I really, really want to emphasize, and Du Bois emphasizes this, and C.L.R. James emphasizes this in The Black Jacobins, this does not uniform throughout history. There are ups and downs, and those ups and downs correspond very closely to the needs of the capitalist economy, right? So you've got new justifications, new explanations, and they're all grounded in these, in these profits. The centrality that these profits grant, if people flip over to page 5, you see the summary that Du Bois gives as being an incredibly powerful, and this is the middle of page 5, where Du Bois says, black labor became the foundation stone, not only of the Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. New cities were built on the results of black labor, and a new labor problem involving all white labor arose both in Europe and America. That's very interesting, right? What Du Bois is saying is that not only is slavery central in the U.S. South, but it's central in the U.S. as a whole, and it's central between the U.S. and Europe, and it's central for the global economy, right? Again, this contradicts the way that we understand history, either in liberal forms and certain Marxisms, right? At the heart of global capitalism in this period is slavery. That's a crucial piece, right? Not only that, when you see at the end of this phrase, a new labor problem involving white labor in Europe and America emerges, that's the product of this, right? That's a product of these profits, right? The heightening and the amplifying and the speeding up of global capitalism. The fact that this cotton that's being produced is being shipped to textile factories in the US North and in Europe. And those factories are hiring more workers, right? And employing them and exploiting them. And new labor unions and new labor struggles are breaking out. This is the speeding up that slavery is providing, right? That speeding up for Marx is often called primitive accumulation. And there are lots of conversations we could have about that. But that speeding up on the basis of this pedestal of slavery is creating a whole range of dynamics, including the one that we're going to talk about in these chapters. A key one, which is the arrival of white migrant workers, right? Or ethnic white migrant workers from Europe, right? And that's all being built onto this. So Du Bois is saying this is the very center of the global economy. Again, the dialectics of this are very complicated. If you look a little further down the page, this is right in the center of the page. He says, their slavery was a matter of both race and social condition, but the condition was limited and determined by race. There's a circularity there, right? Better understood as a dynamic. Fanon says something almost identical in The Wretched of the Earth when he says they're rich because they're white and they're white because they're rich, right? Again, racial categories are not eternal. They're not biological. We do a great disservice by assuming that the biological framing of white supremacists is what, is the inverse of how we should understand these things. They're not biological, right? They shift over time. They're reinforced over time. Part of the piece we'll be talking about is that those workers arriving in the US are not exactly white either, but we're going to be studying and understanding the process whereby they become white, right? That's the dynamic, and that's the dynamic that we're going to try to track. So you've got white laborers arriving. You've got them engaging in a contradictory way with these black workers, right? Understanding, the way that they relate to these workers. And doing so in a context, and this is worth foregrounding as well, again, we'll return to it today, a context that's facilitated by settler genocide, right? Du Bois is very clear, and again, this is a contradictory thing to be clear about, that workers arriving in the US, migrant workers from Europe, are granted and enjoy a certain access to the possibility of getting land, of gaining some kind of economic benefit in that process. But that's premised precisely on genocide, and so that's a sort of so the settler colonial background is crucial to this understanding. Again, Du Bois is mapping out now the historical emergence of the racial binary. The fact that it emerges only over time, the fact that, again, he begins from the fact that there were free blacks, there were black people who could vote in different states in the 1600s, in the 1700s. That goes away. Why does it go away? Because of the need for a racial binary to govern these profits, right? A lot of people foreground this really important moment in the 1670s known as Bacon's Rebellion. They foreground it for a very important political reason, which is that this was a moment in which you had on the one hand indentured white labor and on the other hand indentured black labor. And in this rebellion, those two groups got together and threatened, in a very serious way to overthrow the plantation structure in Virginia, right? It was the fear of that unification that fed into this as well, right? But of course, you see in Du Bois's account the profits becoming part of this as well. The fear of that unification of black and white labor, both indentured at the time, both sharing a similar legal status, leads to legal distinctions which say, no, enslaved labor is something which is now attached biologically to people from Africa, right? Whereas indentured and even then later on free labor is something that's attached to white people. So what you see in this period is the sort of hardening of that binary, right? The racial binary. The hardening of what we often know and describe as the one-drop rule. Part of this, as Du Bois says, is the elimination of the free black person, right, from the U.S. South and from legal categories. He says, this free black person all of a sudden represents a contradiction, right? If you've got these arguments that are saying biologically black people are meant to be enslaved, and then you have free black people in the U.S. South who have owned property, who have even owned slaves, right, and who have engaged in sort of economic production, then this is a contradiction. As Du Bois puts it, this is on page 7, he must not be. He must be suppressed, enslaved, colonized. Here, important to note that colonized means shipped off to a colony elsewhere. It's a very revealing phrase, but that's what it means in this context, and it'll come up throughout this text. Again, white supremacy is not uniform, it's not eternal, it responds to the sort of ebbs and flows of capitalism and profit. Economically, it determines which workers can be super exploited, right? Who can be worked to death, who can be worked far beyond the acceptable standards of a wage laborer, even though we should bear in mind that in this period, wage laborers were not granted a great deal of rights and protections either. And it also determines which categories of people can be genocided, can be removed to create access to land and natural resources. So you've got the redrawing of this racial binary. Again, the redrawing of the one-drop rule, the reinforcement of its racial character. And this is how we arrive from the first question, which is the question of the centrality of slavery within global capitalism, to the second question. So if you look at the top of page 9, this is the question of what is the relationship between slavery, racial slavery now, and free labor. And here it's really important. We'll read it first, actually. Top of page 9, he says, there was in 1863 a real meaning to slavery, different from that we may apply to the laborer today. It was in part psychological, the enforced feeling of inferiority, the calling of another master, and the standing with hat in hand. It was the helplessness. It was the defenselessness of family life. It was the submergence below the arbitrary will of any sort of individual. It was without a doubt worse in these vital respects than that which exists today in Europe or America. And it was this slavery that fell in America. And here is really important, because what Du Bois is doing is he's actually splitting the difference between different ways of looking at the relationship between wage labor and chattel slavery. And roughly what these look like, and I think many of us are familiar with the political stakes of them, is that there are those who kind of view slavery and chattel slavery as fundamentally and solely determined by racial categories, and those who understand, or would speak rather in terms of something like wage slavery, right? In other words, a sort of something that's determined fundamentally on economic terms, right? These are very different political tendencies, right? And they rely on very different assumptions, right? If you take something like what might be kind of an Afro-pessimist understanding of racial slavery, Orlando Patterson's understanding of slavery as a form of social death fundamentally, there's the tendency to downplay the economic piece that Du Bois is emphasizing. But if you go all the way to the other side, you're essentially flattening slavery into wage labor and saying wage slavery is just like a slightly different form of exploitation, right? Du Bois is really splitting the difference here, right? Because he is trying to say, and he'll even use the phrase wage slavery. He'll say a new slavery that emerged in Europe under capitalism, right? He will use this phrasing, and yet here he's trying to point to something very important, right? What he describes as helplessness, as submergence, as something that's much, much worse, right? In certain aspects, in certain symbolic aspects. And so it's important to understand that he's always trying to map the material in historical ways that these systems shift, transform, differ from one another, engage in relationships and overlap with one another, but he's doing so very, very carefully. And that doesn't facilitate very easy sort of like leaps to a simplistic conclusion, right? About either slavery on the one hand or wage labor on the other. And he restates this in a couple different ways, right? He says, like absolute subjection to the individual will. He says, fundamentally, the fundamental piece is that he could be sold, right? These are very, very fundamental differences and yet they don't always map into maybe material differences in one's way of life or quality of life. Now, we're going to talk a lot about geography, and we're going to talk specifically when you get into this chunk of chapters toward the middle and later parts of this book, where Du Bois goes over every single Reconstruction state to look at the different, the progression of Reconstruction in each of these states. What we're going to see is that there are very serious geographic and economic geographic differences between them, right? Specifically between the sort of old center of the South in Virginia and South Carolina, and the sort of deep South or down the river of Alabama, Mississippi. These are very different configurations. We'll see that. But here he's going to start with some more slightly more, basic geography of the way that the arrangement of U.S. slavery relates to control and resistance. I guess I'll just put it that way. And this begins with two sort of strategic peculiarities, because part of what he's trying to distinguish is how U.S. slavery operated, what gave it its strength as a system, what limited or controlled its kind of resistance. If you look on page 12, he says something about the difference between slave revolts in the West Indies and the lack of an effective revolt in the southern United States, right? Really, really important point here. The Dunning School, which we talked about last time, the historical school that was predominant in U.S. universities at the time Du Bois is writing, really wanted to deny that enslaved people even resisted, right? He wanted to deny that they rebelled, wanted to deny the existence of slave insurrections for the most part, and to say more or less that enslaved people were happy, right? They were relatively comfortable. The patriarchal promises of the U.S. slave system were true in certain ways. And you know what? Du Bois doesn't disagree with everything about this. He says, he literally says at one point in this chapter, the victims of Southern slavery were often happy, right? Again, Du Bois is not trying to make these sort of extreme hyperbolic arguments. He's trying to say, like, again, these are ordinary people living under a system of subjection, which means they found happiness here and there, which means depending on the conditions, they could actually be living, and this is something he'll emphasize, they could be living better than poor white people down the road because they're taken care of, because they have a certain material sort of, quality of life. So he's not denying that, right? But he is saying, and this is an important part of the pushback against this historical school, is to say, no, enslaved Black Americans fought back. They resisted, they rebelled. They often rebelled because they heard about things that had happened in Haiti, right? Because Haitian, enslaved people from Haiti had been brought to the U.S. South and had told them stories of resistance, right? So all of this is happening. And the flip side of this is that U.S. slaveholders in the South are shit scared of the fact that Haiti had happened there and it might happen here, right? This was absolutely a specter that haunts the U.S. slave owner. Du Bois is trying to be more precise, though. He's trying to be more analytic. He's saying, listen, it's different, though. What is different? Geographically, demographically. First and foremost, in Haiti, in many other Caribbean islands, the population of those islands was 90 to 95% enslaved Black people, right? That's a huge difference, right? And this will have crucial consequences for the sort of strategic analysis of of the U.S. South, specifically because, as he puts it, this is on page 12. This is a really crucial page, so I'm just sort of introducing it maybe excessively. The system of slavery demanded a special police force, and such a force was made possible and unusually effective by the presence of the poor whites. This explains the difference between the U.S. South and many Caribbean islands. In the South, the planters were a small class, but they had at their command, this is Du Bois' term, some 5 million poor whites. That is, there were actually more white people to police the slaves than there were slaves. It's a very different demographic, economic, and political arrangement. And it opens directly onto a category that we're going to have, and place a great deal of importance on, which is the category of the police, right? This is the origins of police, if it needs to be said, right? He's using this term to police very broadly, but what we're going to see throughout the course of this book is the birth of what we call police today, right? And we may hear stories, and we often do hear stories and narratives about the police emerging from slave catchers. It's that, but it's also much, much more, right? He's talking about the fact that you had 4 million or 5 million white people to police and oversee 4 million black slaves, right? Very, very different kind of situation with, again, hugely different strategic elements. If you go to the bottom of page 12, he says, gradually the whole white South became an armed and commissioned camp to keep Negroes in slavery and to kill the black rebel. The whole South became an armed and commissioned camp, right? This is also incredibly important because it speaks to the expansiveness of the way that white supremacy is far more than something that's narrow, right? And that the police as a category are far more than the police, right? Again, I could talk about this forever, but like when we think about, we often say 2020, right? The mass rebellions that many of us participated in 2020 began with the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, right? Only 2 of those people were killed by police, right? Ahmaud Arbery was hunted and killed by white vigilantes in Georgia who were policing him. They were doing this work, right, which is voluntary, work of policing, right? And Du Bois is identifying this as central from the very beginning. Why would poor white people engage in this work? Right in the center of this paragraph. And this is the introduction and the emergence of a category that you may have heard and which we'll talk about again, which is the wages of whiteness, right? Considering the economic rivalry of the black and white worker in the North, it would have seemed natural that the poor white would have refused to police the slaves, right? That might make sense. Or you could find economic solidarity between poor, populations. But 2 considerations led him in the opposite direction. First of all, it gave him work and some authority as an overseer, slave driver, and member of the patrol system. But above and beyond this, it fed his vanity because it associated him with the masters. He never regarded himself as a laborer or as a part of any labor movement. The system, and this is really crucial and tragic, right? The system was held stable and intact by the poor white. Again, we're foregrounding something that's going to be essential throughout the text, right? Which is the role that poor white people play in upholding this system, a system that does not benefit them, a system that involves their own oppression and exclusion. And so that's something we'll come back to. The second important geographic piece is the fact that, and this is over on the top of page 13, that slavery in the U.S. South had what he refers to as an escape valve, which is escape. A safety valve, which is escape. Namely, the fact that enslaved people, and specifically those who, as he puts it, are the strongest or the most hard-headed and sort of domineering, would leave the institution as individuals and flee north, right? And again, it's important to understand that as a distinction because it wasn't the same on Caribbean islands, right? I mean, it was true in some ways, but it's different to escape from Haiti than it is to escape across, the Mason-Dixon line into Philadelphia, right? These are very, very different situations. And so what happens is that instead of the compression of resistance that you had on an island, you had this sort of dissimulation of that existence, of that resistance toward the north. So that's another, crucial piece that he really wants to bring in to understand. If you look at page 13, and this is an incredibly condensed chapter, as you've noticed. Like this is barely 15, 16 pages, not even. But so much is being done. Du Bois gives us a really incredibly potent paragraph, right? And it's one that we're going to have to think a lot about because it's about democracy. But if you take away one thing from this book, it should be that it's not just about democracy, right? It's about the way that what Du Bois calls democracy or abolition democracy is intrinsically bound up with something far bigger and with something more radical. So I'm going to read it a little bit. The true significance of slavery in the United States to the whole social development of America lay in the ultimate relation of slaves to democracy. The ultimate relation of slaves to democracy. Now, I spent a lot of time in academia, and so I can actually even picture and remember moments where this phrase was said or read or quoted, and it's taken to be a statement about democracy. In other words, it's taken to be a statement about political rights or political equality. What is the relationship of slaves to democracy? Again, this contradiction he began from, right? We have a country that promises certain rights, but systematically denies those rights to an entire category of people. That is not fundamentally what he's saying here. And it's important to understand why. Because immediately, he changes it to something else. And this is the piece that many people don't quote, right? What were to be the limits of democratic control in the United States if all labor, black as well as white, became free, were given schools and the right to vote? What control could or should be set to the power and action of these laborers? Was the rule of the mass of Americans to be unlimited and the right to rule extended to all men regardless of race and color? Or if not, what power of dictatorship and control, and how would property and privilege be protected? How would property and privilege be protected? So what he's doing there is he's going very quickly from political rights and the category of democracy to economic equality. And he's doing it so quickly that, again, so many people ignore it and misunderstand this, right? They read this book as a book written by the same Du Bois that wrote The Souls of Black Folk, for example. An argument about the contradictions of US racism, about the need to convince the mass of Americans that that's wrong, that it should be corrected through legislation, right? That's not what this book is trying to do, right? He is saying that what happens when you say there's a democracy and you give those rights to working people, and then those people start to vote, and they start to build political projects of their own. He's saying not automatically, that would be too strong. He is saying that means that those people will have and be making greater claims to economic rights, economic equality, power over their labor and power over the workplace, right? That this is a very slippery slope for any society, right? In other words, he is insisting that the democratic question, the political question, is not separate from the economic question. And that's going to be crucial to how he understands the rest of this chapter. And then he goes very quickly into prophetic mode, right? Describing and the sort of arc of this history, summarizing the arc of what we will see in the process of the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction and the aftermath. And he introduces another category which pushes back on what we understand as sort of mainstream Marxist analysis. In the middle of page 15, what I want to highlight is where he says, above all, we must remember that the black worker was the ultimate exploited. The ultimate exploited. And that should be understood in relation to what the Marxist tradition calls the universal class. Very roughly speaking, the proletariat is understood to be a universal class under capitalism. The most exploited, those with no privileges to defend, right? Those who, in the sort of famous phrase, have nothing to lose but their chains. What makes them universal is that by freeing themselves, they free everyone. They overthrow all structures of inequality. They overthrow all class society. Du Bois, though, here is saying that it's black workers in the US context in this moment who are the ultimate exploited, right? They are the universal class. And why? Because we're already seeing the emergence of certain kind of privileges, right? The wages of whiteness is a structure of economic and psychological privilege. Privileges to defend, privileges to uphold, right? So you can't be leading the revolution for Du Bois if the way you lead it will institute a structure of society that upholds your own specific privileges, right? That's not a universal class, right? You have more to lose than just your chains if you're living on the basis of that privilege, right? And he extends this outward as we see him sort of gloss the arc of the end of the chapter. And again, apologies for how much I'm going to read, but his words are so powerful that I think often the best thing we can do is read them over and over again and hear what they're saying, right? This is toward the bottom of 15. It was thus the black worker as founding stone of a new economic system in the 19th century and for the modern world who brought civil war in America. He was its underlying cause in spite of every effort to base the strife upon union and national power. And then he switches gears in an expansive way, in a dramatic way. That dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India and the South Seas and all Africa and the West Indies and Central America and in the United States, that vast majority, that great majority of mankind, on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry, shares a common destiny. And if we flip over to the last page, again, when you're reading Du Bois, focus on these pieces, right? Here is the modern labor problem, the real modern labor problem. Here is the kernel of the problem of religion and democracy, of humanity. Words and futile gestures avail nothing. Out of the exploitation of the dark proletariat comes the surplus value filched from human beasts, which in cultured lands the machine and harnessed power veil and conceal. The emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black. We see the circularity there again, right? He says, no, it's not about this, it's about labor, but labor is about race, right? So he moves from the absolute exploited, the most exploited sector of the US economy to this broadly expansive view of what he calls the dark proletariat. And again, in light of what we've been thinking about and saying about the relationship between race and class is very interesting, right? Because it's a racial class category, right? It's a category that specifies which part of or which understanding of the proletariat and the working class Du Bois is interested in. And so we want to hang on to that, not only in the connection between dark and proletariat, but also in the global scope, right? Also in the fact that he expands very quickly outward to be speaking about third world struggles, about revolutionary struggles across the globe, right? Again, he's sliding very quickly into his own context, which is the 1930s, where he's fighting against imperialism, fighting against the expansion of US imperialism, right? And that's very much on his mind. So he's trying to connect these two periods, these two categories across national bounds as well. Now that's the first chapter. I have a few more things to say about the second chapter. Do we want to take a couple questions either from the chat or in the room first? And we may just keep it to a few minutes and then we'll, because a lot of the questions will probably all already kind of point toward this next chapter on the white worker as well.
I saw you first, Lucas. So let's see if this will work. Can we check online to see if... Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Say it loud and say it proud, please.
Right. Last week you said that Du Bois doesn't really engage with settler colonialism. Are you saying that he will in the upcoming chapters, or is that something that we're gonna have to keep in mind?
I mean, that's a good question. I think it's something that we need to sort of supplement and read in and analyze. The leap here is not so much to settler colonialism as a US domestic question. It's to the global scale in which he's sort of, if anything, leaping from, chattel slavery and its relationship to economic exploitation of white workers in the US to global colonialism, right? I think what is missing is that invisible background, which is the settler colonial project at home. And again, that has implications, right? It has really crucial implications. There are hints of it. There are, moments where it comes up, but it's never, I think, enough or what we want. And also, again, I think I mentioned it last time, he's not telling the whole story of even what's happening in Black communities and Black struggles. And there's a great deal of more recent work. Often talk about Tulani Davis's recent book, Emancipation Circuits, which is a really great book that talks about what happens when, formerly enslaved people create these sort of camps and, public spheres at the Union encampments, right, during the war, and they're creating new forms of community. He's not talking about all the collective projects that people are doing on land that's managed collectively. He's very interested in those, but the story he's telling is very different.
Gotcha.
I have a kind of in the weeds question.
Love it. We love
But
it.
on page 10, he spends some time, especially towards the bottom, kind of differentiating between the treatment slaves received from their masters versus like other white people who were their caretakers. And I feel like he's making kind of an argument to differentiate the masters and highlight them as maybe more reasonable. Like, really, what is the purpose of this argument to him in this chapter, in this moment? It just feels kind of random. Yeah, curious.
I mean, on the one hand, I think some of that is just kind of laying out the reality of those relationships, right? The legal basis, he's like working through the legal basis. He also then says, right, the law is often more severe than what happens in practice, right? And part of it is that he is doing this interesting thing, which I think you're pointing toward, right? Which is the fact that he's not trying to say that the entirety of the patriarchal myth of slavery is 100% false, because that would actually, for him, be a strategic misunderstanding of the system, right? He wants to understand why it's strong in certain ways. He wants to understand why maybe there were people that didn't resist in the same ways. And again, as we move forward into the later chapters, he wants to understand why control in the sort of patriarchal plantation communities of Virginia and the northern part of the South were more hegemonic and ideologically effective than basically the plantation factories of Mississippi, right? Where it's all about pure force, pure domination, the extraction of maximum, amounts of labor. These are very different, forms of control and power. And part of what he always wants to understand is how those forms of domination work. Again, because he wants to understand how to resist them, how they were resisted in moments that they weren't. So I think that's part of it, right? Again, he has no stake in denying everything that defenders of slavery are saying. And I think he sees the best arguments to be made on the grounds of sort of leveraging some of those pieces that would be shared, right?
Well, we have
We have a virtual question.
and then I'll get back to you.
Yeah. So a question we have from the chat is: would you mind outlining the timeline of Du Bois's interaction with Marxism in relation to this dissertation? So, kind of, what's his relationship with Marxism at this time? Is he a Marxist? Where is he at?
Yes.
When he writes,
At this time, he's definitely a Marxist, right? And again, I think it's always important to qualify that, because Du Bois and many, I don't want to speak in overly general terms, but Marxism and Black struggle are always sort of intersecting and overlapping, but there's always this really powerful tension, right? Some of our most important thinkers are either not members of official communist parties, or they join them and then they leave them, right? Richard Wright joins and leaves, Aimé Césaire joins and leaves. People like Fanon and Du Bois are sort of like overlapping with, and struggling with them, but all, very often for the same reason, right? Which is the fact that these parties are very mechanical in their understanding of Marxism in the world, and they don't understand the reality of what Black struggle means, right? And what it means for Du Bois and for C.L.R. James and for Aimé Césaire is that it is a labor struggle, right? And this is the fundamental piece I think that he's trying to get across. When he speaks of the American blind spot, it means different things. It means just race in general, but the narrow meaning that he gives to what he calls the American blind spot is the fact that white workers do not see a working class struggle in the struggle against slavery, right? There's a categorical misconception, right? And this is something that is fed into by certain elements of Marxism. Again, in the next chapter, he's going to show how Marx himself had a much better understanding of it, a much more nuanced understanding of it, right? And C.L.R. James will go to great lengths to say, no, the Black struggle is a class struggle, right? It already is. It doesn't need to become one, but it is, right, in a lot of ways. We'll talk about that, a little bit in the next chapter as well.
Coming around for your question.
Thank you, Rue. I think there are more discussion topics and questions. One was, you talked about sort of the omission of the indigenous communities until towards the end of the book. In his, on page 13 through 15, he doesn't mention red as one of, it's like yellow, brown, black, exploitation, global exploitation. And it's interesting that is cast under the Black worker chapter. And And then versus like what's happening in the West Indies, perhaps around this time with coolies, indentured labor coming from the global majority, and wondering if because on U.S. soil that hasn't happened, there's still that distinction versus that kind of wedging that can happen where poor white indentured, workers then fall into the supremacist sort of like propaganda and start being irrational in how they view. So just wondering how the geography or some sort of these immigration policies may have played into his consideration of, brown and yellow communities to be sitting under Black worker chapter. And and then also the omission of the indigenous, is that because they're not part of this sort of like international political economy at this point, and it's more that they're exiled or completely disenfranchised? That was very long.
No, that's a great question. It's super, super thoughtful. And I think there's a couple different things happening around the indigenous question, right? Some of this is a little speculative. Some of it is sort of based on just a gut feeling for the way Du Bois is and the way he thinks, right? And one thing that I would say is that I think, despite the fact that last time I mentioned that calling this Black Reconstruction of Democracy in America was a critique of Alexis de Tocqueville's, book Democracy in America, right? Which very clearly relegated the question of indigenous and Black struggle and antagonism to the end of the book, right? He said, American democracy is great, it's this great experiment, it's got all this to it. And then at the end, he says, here are two dangerous problems for it, the three races of the Americas, right? And it's like, how do you put that to the side? How do you talk about democracy as this amazing project and then keep what he saw, what even Tocqueville saw as profound antagonisms, right? He said the presence of the slave is a contradiction which will lead to war, essentially. And he was right about that, right? But I think Du Bois reproduces a key piece of the way that Du Bois distinguishes, for example, between Black communities and indigenous communities, right? Which is to say, Black Americans were a threat at the heart of American democracy, in the center of it, at the heart of it. And indigenous communities were excluded and disappearing and dying, right? It's a sort of sad narrative, right? This like kind of liberal narrative of indigenous genocide is already accomplished, right? Tocqueville is saying this. I think there's ways that Du Bois is reproducing this, right? But that's also to I think lean toward the second piece of your question, which is to say this is in part because of the way that Du Bois is putting together this narrative. It's very much about and centered on the centrality of enslaved people within U.S. capitalism. That is, as we're going to see, the key to the general strike. It's the key to the transformation of the narrative around Reconstruction. But what some of the literature that I was just mentioning contributes to fleshing out is what Du Bois doesn't tell, right? It's because Du Bois is so focused on this piece about strategic centrality that it misses questions like, for example, like, well, what about the fact that like the power that enslaved people got was from their centrality within the slave economy in the US South, but like that's not the kind of economy they would want to build, right? That's not the economy they built on collective projects where they were growing the things they wanted and things that they needed, right? Enslaved communities couldn't eat cotton, right? And so between what we would call exchange value, in other words, what the value of something is for capitalism, and the use value of what communities would do and produce on their own, there's a big gap. And Du Bois is systematically focused on the one hand, the state, right? Individual states, their projects, legislative debates, legislation, Supreme Court debates, all of this is a huge part of what he's talking about. And he's focused on what's central to the capitalist economy, right? Again, there are reasons that he's doing that, but a lot of what's accidentally left out are those things that are not as central, right? But which are actually super crucial to us understanding the alternative world that people would want to build. Yeah.
One more question that we have, and then we'll move on to the second chapter. One person from the chat asked, is spirituality/religion important to Du Bois as he tries to explain the why or how of American slavery?
Spirituality and religion important? In certain ways, yes, 100%, right? We know from anyone that's read Du Bois knows that spiritual and religious metaphors and categories and spirituals, right? Like the actual, songs are central sort of punctuating pieces of souls of Black folk. The spirituality that emerges through the poems and the rhetorical flourishes in this book are crucial. At the same time, he's also, I mean, I think it's an open debate, right? He's also a very rationalizing secular kind of analyst, right? Again, though, this came up last time when we were asking the question of, is he a historical scientist, or is he a philosopher, or is he a prophet? And I think there has to be, all of those involved, right? And I think the reason is because he is looking at not only structures and how we resist them, but the fact that when we resist them, we're always resisting because of something much bigger, right? Human behavior is never determined by calculation, right? It's determined by categories like freedom, dignity, equality, and what those mean, and the meaning that those categories kind of gain, right, through the course of struggle. So I think that's not to speak of religion per se, but it's more to speak of the way the spirituality always involves a spiritualization of material struggles. This is a long, long debate in Marxism, right, where you have this interesting tendency of third world and non-white Marxists to push back on the heavy, heavy materialism of Marxism and towards something like a spiritualization, right? And Du Bois knew as well as anyone else that spirituals, for example, in songs, these were also key means of communication, right? What he'll call the underground telegraph, which is this inexplicable mode of communication between enslaved people on different plantations, sometimes very far apart from each other, and slave owners were wondering how people were sort of gathering this information. That's part of this, right? The way in which these songs and these sort of modes of communication assume and take on very different forms. So I think that's really crucial as well. These questions are so incredibly good. I think I'll say a few things about the second chapter, though, and we'll take another round toward the end. We're moving on to the white worker, right? This is obviously crucial. There's a different structure to this chapter. Again, Du Bois is putting these chapters in relation to each other. He's writing them as parallel chapters. But what he has to say about black workers is very, very different from what he has to say about white workers, right? And what he specifically has to say about black workers is most of the story, right? Slavery is central to capitalism. It exists in relation to wage labor and other forms of exploitation, but is a more profound and submerged form of kind of oppression. So the question is, in part, what is the white, and again, he's already foregrounded the wages of whiteness, right? He's already mentioned white people being police in the first chapter. What is it that this second chapter adds? And again, if we look at the summary, he says, how America became the laborer's promised land. And flocking here from all the world, the white workers competed with black slaves, with new floods of foreigners, and with growing exploitation until they fought slavery to save democracy and then lost democracy in a new and vaster slavery. This is fucking wild, right? And again, he's doing exactly what he was pushing back on in some ways, right? Because he's saying that capitalist exploitation is a form of slavery. He is saying that. And he's also insisting that we need to maintain some kind of differentiation between these different forms of slavery. But he's telling this dynamic story again of migrant laborers arriving in the US, engaging with enslaved people in a contradictory and confrontational way, struggling on some level for democracy and then losing that democracy, right? So the arc is very interesting, and it's something to emphasize. This is not a chapter that's strictly, speaking about the white working class, right? It's fundamentally about the contradiction that they pose, right? It's about the contradictory modes of ideology. He's not saying as much about where they come from or sort of what their sort of demographic background is. He's talking about the political power structures that they come to inhabit. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. And from the very beginning, ideology is really crucial to the way he tells the story of this chapter, right? From the very beginning, he talks about the opportunity, the very real opportunities that, again, were offered in the U.S. Again, those opportunities gleaned from genocide, the expansive availability of land, of course, which had belonged to indigenous people. And he talks about the fact that when they arrived even, or almost as soon as they arrived, they embraced a very different kind of mindset than they had ever had before, even based on the material conditions that they had enjoyed. That's maybe a very overcomplicated way to put it. But it's something that's very clear. It's something that's always been very clear when you look at, for example, the general radicalism of, say, the Irish workers' movement, or general political consciousness in Ireland, or in Italy, right? The working class movements in Italy. And then you see what happens as soon as Italian Americans or Irish Americans arrive within the US. And so there's something here which is not explicitly about who these people are or where they're coming from, but it's about the context and the political context that they're being put into, right? Which is, again, a settler colonial capitalist society. Both of those pieces are important, right? Again, opportunity, this idea of sort of, that labor and that effort creates wealth is going to be crucial to their conceptualization, right? And their understanding of themselves. They arrive hoping to become capitalists, right? This is what Du Bois will call, elsewhere, he doesn't use the phrase here, but it's a thread throughout the book. He'll call it the American assumption. The American assumption. The American assumption is that effort, industry, is what creates success and wealth, right? It's a bootstraps theory. It essentially says the US is a situation in a context in which if you work hard enough, you can become rich and become an exploiter of your own, right? That you can then exploit labor. That's the basis of this American assumption, right? And there's moments that are very, very interesting where he'll say, you know what, in the US, in this moment, it was closer to true than anywhere else on earth, right? Again, because of access to land, because of this sort of settler genocide. But it's also a lie. And it's also a lie that has a fundamental implication for political consciousness, right? How does that play out in the north of the US? Most of what he's talking about here when it comes to unionized workers and the debates is about the northern part of the US. It plays out in violence, right? It plays out in mass race riots based on the perception and the idea that enslaved people represent competition to these white ethnic workers. It leads to, in Du Bois's terms, a race war. This is on page 18. Philadelphia is right at the heart of this race war in the early decades of the 19th century. The fundamental question, though, is what was the basis of this race war, and why was it contradictory, and why was it based on a misunderstanding of reality? And the key for Du Bois is, and he says this over and over again in different places. If we look on page 19, or actually better on page 20, he says, what they fail to comprehend, this is toward the bottom, 2/3 of the way down on page 20. What they failed to comprehend was that the black man enslaved was an even more formidable and fatal competitor than the black man free. The black man enslaved was more of a competitor than the black man free. And he also says elsewhere that slavery tends to reduce all labor towards slavery. It pulls all labor down, right? What he's talking about is the fact that the real competition was between these workers and a structure. It was the system of slavery, right? A system that maximized exploitation, that paid no wages aside from just bare living expenses, right? That was the system that white workers were up against. As we'll talk about in a minute, that was the system that poor whites in the South were up against and excluded from. The effect of that system was to drag down all wages, to drag down all conditions. Because instead of those workers getting a wage and protections, you had people that could be exploited to death or nearly to death, right? The misunderstanding was that these workers, if freed, would represent competition, whereas the impact would be the improvement of all workers' conditions, the impact of the abolition of slavery. This is something, he goes through all the debates and everything and all the working men's associations. This is something that Marx grasped, right? This is something that some elements of the working class grasped, but not all. And it's something, and the reason that I often bring it up, and I mentioned it on here somewhere. I mention it, very often, is the fact that we see the very same arguments made about migrants today. And it's based on the exact same misunderstanding. He even, at some point, he quotes Lincoln to debunk this, right? Even Lincoln saw the fact that he's like, listen, if you abolish slavery, the conditions of all laborers will be elevated, right? But this economic confusion, of course, becomes an ideological confusion. It's something that's upheld and reinforced and supported by those who want to stoke racial hatred among workers, right? And so it becomes an important leverage point. Again, migrants today do not drive down wages. Immigration enforcement drives down wages. Why? Because it's immigration enforcement that says certain categories of workers don't get minimum wage, don't get legal protections, can't quit, right? Don't have access to the kind of rights that other workers, enjoy access to, right? So it's incredibly important and politically crucial to understand that the same exact thing is happening at this moment. And it's happening with regard to the system of slavery. Now, in this chapter, one of the main contradictions Du Bois is going to point out is the fact that there are, as he puts it, two labor movements. The labor movements he's describing are northern workers, unionized, organized wage workers for the most part, and abolitionists themselves. Why does he call abolitionists a labor movement? Because it's a movement for the liberation of black labor, right? This is what northern workers don't understand, largely. This is what many of their representatives don't understand, that it is itself a labor struggle, and that the abolition of slavery would be what he refers to as the greatest labor revolution the US had ever seen, right? So again, this American racial blind spot prevents this understanding that abolition was a labor struggle. But it's not, the understanding doesn't simply move in that direction, right? Because there were, and we'll come back to this in other chapters, that while part of what he's critiquing is the fact that white workers had internalized this racism, had internalized this sort of wages of whiteness kind of privileged categories. Abolitionists themselves didn't understand themselves as labor struggle, right? And this is key, right? In part because they were fundamentally tainted by the American assumption as well, right? Abolition represented capital. In other words, abolition meant people's freedom to become wage laborers. And so there were key misunderstandings on both sides. There was sort of petty bourgeois ideology in the abolitionist movement, and there was a racial blind spot built into the working class movement of the North in particular. Now, ironically, this divide for Du Bois is mostly occurring in the North, right? Or he understands it largely to be northern labor, northern unions versus this unseen category and misunderstood and forgotten category of black workers in the US South. But this misses a huge piece of the puzzle that he then sort of identifies. This is on page 26. If we flip over there. He says, in all this, at the top of 26, in all this consideration, we've so far ignored the white workers of the South. And we've done this because the labor movement ignored them and the abolitionists ignored them. And above all, they were ignored by northern capitalists and southern planters. They were in many respects almost a forgotten mass of men. Again, the poor whites of the South that we've already said are 5 million strong, are the basis of the policing and the stability of this system, are at the same time, as he puts it, forgotten. And here the sort of descriptions are really visceral, right? He says they live dispersed over vast plains in a condition little removed from absolute barbarism. A wretched log hut or two are the only habitations in sight. A destitute class who make a precarious living by peddling light wood in the cities. He goes on and on about the conditions, about the distinction between the mountain whites and the lowland whites. A family of 5 people, all ill-clothed and unclean, a blear-eyed old woman, a younger woman with a mass of tangled red hair. Most of them are illiterate, more than correspondingly ignorant. Some of them have Indian ancestors and a few bear evidences of Negro blood. This was, as he puts it, a forgotten and excluded class, right? And they were excluded for a reason. Again, because the system of slavery, the entirety of the Southern process and, of production, the entire basis for the Southern economy was based at this point on black labor and nothing else, right? In other words, this entire group was pushed out of the economy, was excluded, existed on the margins of it. And they existed under conditions, material conditions that Du Bois himself again admits were in many conditions worse than the conditions that enslaved people themselves lived under. Again, be super clear, he doesn't say it's worse or better, he says the material conditions might have been worse. They were not subjected to the absolute control, absolute domination, absolute, process of, desubjectification, you could call it, of enslaved people. But on a material level, this condition was absolutely horrific. And again, for a reason, right? Because they were not part of the economy. Their competition was what was with that system. And this will play out in very contradictory ways in the process of Reconstruction. Again, he returns to this question of the police patrol. This is on the bottom of page 27. They constituted the police patrol who could ride with the planters and now and then exercise unlimited force upon recalcitrant or runaway slaves. And then, too, there was always a chance that they might themselves become the planters by saving money, by investment, by the power of good luck. And the only heaven that attracted them was the life of the great Southern planter. So you've got material things moving in conjunction and in tandem with psychological dynamics. And the most important consequence of this, the most important implication is that, as he puts it right above that, it nullifies the deep-rooted antagonism to black people nullifies the class antagonism that these people had toward the planters, right? The class hatred that they had, which boiled up, which was often on the verge of exploding, right? This was nullified by anti-black racism and the material privileges of the wages of whiteness, right? That's really, really crucial to understand. And the embodiment, the crystallization of this is the function of the police, right? Again, psychological, because you can exercise domination, you can feel better, you can feel superior, you don't have shit in your life, but you can feel better than someone else, psychological. But that's always also a material piece, right? You can ride with the planters, you can catch a runaway slave and return them for a bounty, right? These are material pieces as well. You can get a job as an overseer, as a slave breaker. This is the way that the political sort of wages of whiteness play a material and psychological role in upholding the system. Now, interestingly, like the enslaved people in the South, Du Bois talks about the fact that there was an escape valve for the poor whites as well, right? They could also leave. They could actually leave more freely, of course, than enslaved people. But instead of going north to the cities, where did they go? They went west. They went west looking for land. And this creates, in many ways, and generates the contradiction that sets off the war, which is the question of whether or not slavery would expand westward. The so-called free soil movement, which is the movement that says the land to the west should not be slave land, should not be, slave states. The contradiction here plays out though, right? Which is to say the free soil movement is always also about keeping black people out of the West, right? Because of this misunderstanding and this idea that the competition was directly with the individuals instead of with the system. So there's both of those pieces happening. But it's built into that history, the fact that there was an attempt to make these white states, right? Non-slave states, yes, that's good, but also white states, which of course is not. And the contradiction of this comes to a head as Du Bois emphasizes in Bleeding Kansas, right? Which is really the first shots that lead to the Civil War. Occur in these struggles in Kansas over whether or not Kansas would be a free state or a slave state. This is where John Brown helps to, set off those very same shots. And all of those contradictions are built into it. Now, if we turn over to 30, maybe a little bit before it, because Du Bois is talking about Kansas, he describes Kansas in that contradiction and the sort of contradiction of this sort of white vigilante violence that's happening in the cities, but also that's happening in the West. And he says, this brings us down to the period of the Civil War. So part of what he's doing in these two chapters is to lay out these two categories in a historical trajectory that leads us up to the conflict, right? That's where he's leaving us, which is why he immediately then goes into, again, describing the arc of what is to come. And I'll just do some more reading and then think about some of the contradictions that this passage on 29 into 30 raises. He says, America thus stepped forward in the first blossoming of the modern age and added to the art of beauty, gift of the Renaissance, into the freedom of belief, gift of Martin Luther and Leo X, a vision of democratic self-government, the domination of political life by the intelligent decision of free and self-sustaining man. What an idea, and what an area for its realization, endless land of richest fertility, natural resources such as earth seldom exhibited before. Already we see this contradiction, right? Is Du Bois really saying this is the land of, endless opportunity because of the genocide of indigenous people, right? Because of the easy access to land? To what degree does he believe this, or is he just saying it as a framing that then allows us to think about what comes next? But it's hard to distinguish the two sometimes. And then some unjust God leaned laughing over the ramparts of heaven and dropped a black man in the midst. It transformed the world. It turned democracy back to Roman imperialism and fascism. It restored caste and oligarchy. It replaced freedom with slavery and withdrew the name of humanity from the vast majority of human beings. But not without struggle. And that piece is really crucial for Du Bois, right? Not without struggle. Then came this battle called the Civil War, beginning in Kansas in 1854 and ending in the presidential election of 1876. 20 awful years. The slave, and this is the key phrase of the book, right? The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. The whole weight of America was thrown to color caste. The colored world went down before England, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, and America. Here again, transitioning from slavery to global imperialism. A new slavery arose. The upward moving of white labor was betrayed into wars for profit based on color caste. Democracy died, save in the hearts of black folk. Indeed, the plight of the white working class throughout the world today is directly traceable to Negro slavery in America. There's so much going on in this passage. It's really impossible, and we will come back to it, and we'll pull it apart. We'll try to untangle these threads. But one thing that Du Bois is clearly trying to note, and what he'll return to, is the fact that the defeat of Reconstruction opens up the possibility of U.S. imperialism, creates the era of U.S. imperialism. That this arc he's describing and narrating domestically with the Civil War to this moment of Reconstruction, this possibility of multiracial egalitarian democracy, is betrayed, is defeated, and with that defeat, imperialism becomes the name of the game on a global level, right? Implicit in this is the idea that if that had been, staved off domestically, right? If white supremacy was not allowed to continue to govern on the domestic level, things could look different on a global level. But the two are powerfully intertwined, the US context and the global imperialist context. And again, I say that over and over again because Du Bois is a sort of powerfully global thinker. This book is about not just slavery in the US, but it's about US imperialism on a global level as well. So I want to leave you with that. And I want to leave you with the question about the degree to which Du Bois himself believes in this sort of myth of American democracy as this moment of possibility, and what would be required for him to believe that that's true. But I know we're running a little bit late on time, and so I did want to make some time for some more questions. We have like 10 minutes maybe for questions. The last question I posed was the question of whether or not Du Bois, when he's saying like this was the land of this, incredible democratic possibility, right? And one of the questions is, does he really believe that, right? Again, built into that question is possibility because of genocide, right? But then also this question of what would it mean for that democracy to be a real democracy, right? He's doing this thing where he's playing with like, the democracy we have, clearly not amazing. The democracy that's possible, What is this promise? Is it the promise of the Constitution? Like, these kinds of questions, and where Du Bois actually falls.
Ready to
I have kind of a two-part question. In the first chapter, the bit, above all, we must remember the black worker was the ultimate exploited, kind of made me think about like the contemporary context, and if you could speak on like the groups that could be considered the ultimately exploited. And then the second part is, I guess, also speaking on the contemporary context of this text in like the ways in which the hatred of enslaved people was leveraged against white exploited workers to essentially distract from like class revolt, and how that again is like being, perpetuated in a contemporary context.
Yeah, those are great questions. They're super essential, right? On the first, Du Bois is writing this almost a century ago, 90 years ago, but he's really decades and decades ahead in terms of his understanding of who's going to lead the struggles of the future, right? Because you have a whole wave of anti-colonial thinkers and rebellions and struggles that are breaking out that are operating precisely on these questions, right? And responding to these kinds of dynamics. Fanon is a very good parallel to some of these pieces. I'll bring Fanon up a lot. I'll bring C.L.R. James up a lot. I'll bring Walter Rodney up a lot. But an important thing Fanon says, and it's very controversial, right? He's looking at Africa. He's looking at colonized spaces in Africa and Algeria in particular, and he says the working class is pampered, right? Again, controversial thing to say. This is a class of people working in the docks and the port areas in particular that are exploited, that are abused 100%. But what he's saying is that they have a strategic position within colonial exploitation that means that the colonial system is willing to buy them off and give them this privileged position so that they don't revolt and rebel and shut the system down, right? All that Fanon is doing is trying to say who has the most chains and who is most likely to revolt and lead this struggle. And it's not the wage workers of the port cities, right? He says it's the peasantry in the countryside. It's the so-called lumpen proletariat in and around the shanty towns of the cities, right? Fanon is doing the same thing as Du Bois, which is to say, let's do a material analysis and see who is the most exploited, right? And again, we see that despite Marxist sort of Marxism's tendency to dismiss the peasantry, we see that many revolutions in the 20th century were led by peasant struggles, right? Proletarianized peasants, right? Peasants who didn't own land, peasants who were, forced to work, on what were essentially factories in the countryside, right? And so all of these things, I think, need to be reanalyzed on a material level. And Du Bois, again, was about 20 or 30 years ahead of many people who began to do that as a way of understanding the global anti-colonial struggles, for sure. The second piece is a piece that we're going to talk about over and over again, which is to what degrees is white supremacy and racial hatred used today to distract from the material oppression of wage laborers, white workers in particular, right? And not only white workers, right, which is the barely employed, poor whites of rural areas of this country who are dying in droves of opioid overdoses, right? Who don't have shit to their name, who don't have any money or any job. The only jobs they can get is maybe as cops, but maybe as like a security guard or a CO in a prison, right? And these people are voting for Trump, right? And they're voting because they're being promised something, which is a lie, which is a promise of economic. The price of eggs is going to go down. We see how that's going, of course. But also, they're being sold this story that the actual cause is, again, these individuals who are crossing the border, right? Or Islam, right? Or, all of these sort of categories. But what's really important is that they're being leveraged as a way to explain away the very real material, consequences of capitalism that people are suffering. So 100% relevant. And that's why, again, people started reading this again in 2016. I mean, that was way too late, but they should have been reading it way before that. But they started reading it because it really spoke to not the mechanical relationship between race and class, but the dynamic way that it was playing out and the way that it led to something that many liberals couldn't predict, which was Trump's victory and then victory again, right? Yeah.
So we have a clarifying question in the chat.
Yeah.
Earlier when we were having questions about chapter 1, someone mentioned the kind of exclusion of Native American voices and like kind of presence within Black Reconstruction. So someone from the chat was asking, is Du Bois perpetrating the quote unquote extinct Indian myth? Just as like a clarifying point to kind of like bring back the question.
I don't think explicitly, but maybe implicitly. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, right? And again, I want to be as generous as possible with the fact that he is trying to explain a very specific dynamic of power and forces, right? And so part of what is probably going on is the idea that, you know, for example, forces that were tangential to that struggle, he leaves to the side, right? And again, he does that with groups of people and categories of people and spaces that he takes very seriously, right? He leaves them aside because he's trying to tell a kind of story, right? So I want to be aware of the fact that he's doing partly that, but that writing in the 1930s, you know, I wouldn't be super surprised if he understood the basics of the indigenous struggle as, you know, the tragic liberal myth of the disappearance of indigenous people, at the very least as a political force, right? I wouldn't be surprised about that, right? Yeah. I think we have time for just one or two
Ask your
more.
question.
It's such a quick question. I don't even know if the microphone is going to reach me.
No, please. It's fine.
I was just sorry. Sorry. I was just wondering why he repeats a paragraph word for word. If you have any thought on that, like the first paragraph of the white worker.
Yeah, he does it a couple times. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I don't have a good answer for that. I think he does cut and paste in different pieces, right? And it happens later in the book as well. And it's really just about kind of repeating and reinforcing things that he's already said, I think. Yeah. But you'll notice when he does it, and it's very key moments as well. I think it's like, I don't know, it's like I wrote it so well the first time, like why would I try to tell it again? Yeah. Cool. Do we have one more? Or we?
There's a question from the chat that says, could you speak more about what might be meant by Du Bois on page 30 when he says, some unjust God leaned, laughing over the ramparts of heaven, and dropped a black man in the middle?
Yeah.
I'm trying to find out what part of the page it's on, but
Yeah, it's toward the top of that page, right? It's where he's talking about that potential and that possibility and that beautiful, promise of American democratic self-government, right? Again, I'm already raising questions about whether or not Du Bois fully believes and embraces that. I think on a certain level he can't, right? And on a certain level he is running with the narrative to strengthen the reaction and the sort of the effect of what he then identifies as, right, this emergence of race and racism, right? And it's important to understand it in that way. Again, this is the way he's explaining the whole story and describing the whole arc, which is that white supremacy in the form that we understand it and in the form that it was experienced in the middle of the 19th century was not always that way, right? And that's why he says, some unjust God leaned laughing over the ramparts of heaven and dropped a black man in the midst, right? It's not simply that there's this thing called white supremacy that is the eternal governing structure of global history. It's that it's something that was built and developed and created in reaction to not only the presence of Black people in the US and other parts of the world as slaves, but the contradictions that those produced. And the fact that those ethical and political contradictions couldn't simply be resolved because of the economic importance of those workers, right? Capitalism in the US was not going to voluntarily get rid of slavery. Slavery was being abolished in other parts of the world already because it wasn't a very efficient political and economic system, right? But at this moment in particular, because of the value of cotton, because of the structure of agricultural land, which we'll talk about next time in the chapter on the planter, that was not going to happen voluntarily. And so the contradiction comes to a head, right? And so this is the kind of question that he's raising, and he's raising it in those incredibly poetic terms because he wants to show the implications for democracy. Again, this is where he's like overplaying that democratic promise because he said it turned democracy back to Roman imperialism and fascism. The presence of slavery, the presence of that contradiction transforms, debases, debilitates, eliminates what we would even understand as democracy, right? So again, Du Bois from the very beginning, I'm sure, knows that US democracy was built on that from the beginning, was built on that fascism, always had that potential built into it. And so he's trying to exaggerate, I think, that arc a little bit, but for an effect. Cool. I'm sure you all are very tired. I'm also very tired. I know that we took a little extra time because of our sort of glitches. We will work on smoothing those out for next week. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to those who are online. Next week, we're going to read about the planter. And be aware in that chapter of the fact that, again, he's talking about a class, he's talking about a category of landholders, but he's also talking about a structure of political power. And he's also talking about being super attentive to the contradiction of the planter. This is what, folks should be, pulling out toward the end of this chapter is, why did the contradiction, the economic contradiction of the planter class lead to the Civil War? That's really key. So cool. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Clap, clap, clap. Clap, clap, clap.
Yeah, so you'll get it done.